been a very intense week, I think, and I think it's been a very fascinating week. Kind of just really chaotic with the world, and I think this is kind of weirdly enough the start of something. Not to be like doomsday, but I just feel like this is just like the catalyst for something that's probably going to be a little bit bigger. But let me explain. So, within a span of a couple days, there's been, I guess you could say, two sorts of revolutions, insurrections, just people going against the fundamental aspects of their government. They want to really have genuine change. I forgot which one was first, but I'm going to start with South Africa. So, I don't know anything about South African politics, I just don't. But I will find it very interesting that the former South African president, Jacob Zuma, was imprisoned for 15 months. I think specifically because they gave him some court orders and he's told him to just basically go screw himself because he was under investigation. Because he was a South African president for a decade, from like 2008 or 2009 to a couple years ago, and he had given out some contracts to various different groups. Excuse me. In order for him to have political leeway to choose which cabinet members to influence South African politics. It's politics. And again, I don't know the whole story about that. It could be something along the lines of, people just taking advantage of him in a particular political situation now that he's not in office. It seems real, finicky, because by all accounts, he's a very popular person there and a very popular president when he was in office. But again, depends on how you want to look at it, depends what sources you look at, and it seems, generally speaking, that the specific outrage that's happening is really genuine when it comes to the imprisonment of Jacob Zuma. So, in the capitals of South Africa and various other parts of the country, Johannesburg, there's just been rioting, been looting, been just a full-on borderline insurrection that's been genuinely going on, and I think it's fascinating. Rioting, looting, destruction. I think as of today, there's probably been, the death tolls are like 75 people. And people are fighting back. They're just throwing rocks. The army has been deployed. People are basically just fighting against the military. My goodness, it's just a mini little war zone that's going on out there. And everything's just in complete dysfunction. And there's a weird racial aspect of it too, with the white minority people, I guess you could say the richer landowner people who hold a lot of power. There's a lot of tension there, a lot of potential violence that's been and potentially going to happen. So we'll see what happens with that specifically. And I don't know. I think it's very strange. Probably not the right way to put it. My thought process ultimately is like there's a lot of destruction going on, and I don't know if it's because specifically there's people taking advantage of a particular situation or if it's genuine. I think it's a little bit of both. Personally, I think people are really fed up with the inequality, the fundamental poverty that they've been living in relative comparison to their richer counterparts, and ultimately want some change. And at the same time, it's like if I can loot a Walmart with 10,000 other people, I'll loot a Walmart with 10,000 other people. If I can steal from hospitals and disrupt certain change and stuff to actually make a point, then so be it, And it's really fascinating because, a lot of people are saying it's like doomsday kind of thing. It's the end of the world in South Africa. And, parts of it probably is. But, I think it's the start of something. And where it goes, it can go in two different directions where it's complete, total destruction of a country. Or it's probably something that's just going to pop up. And then, who knows what happens after that specifically. And then, just so happens as well, comes Cuba. Which, before we actually talk about Cuba, I do want to point out one thing, though, that there hasn't really been a lot of talk specifically about what's happening in South Africa, I think, in terms of American politics, really. I mean, it's just on, like, the world news stage, but no one's really talking about it. And the reason why no one's really talking about it is because of Cuba. And Cuba's basically this weird ideological place at this point with how, people are looking at it from the left, the right, the middle. It's all fascinating. So, for those of you who don't know, which if you're listening to this, I don't know how you wouldn't, because if you're listening to this, you probably know more than I do, to be quite honest with you. Yeah, the Cuba's fascinating historically. It's basically a part of just American history in terms of one of the colonies that we had. I believe it might have been from the Spanish-American War, specifically from Spain. Then we accumulated them along with a bunch of, Haiti, not Haiti, God, what am I thinking? The Philippines, etc., etc. My brain's not working right now. I can't think of things historically, so I do apologize if I get things wrong. But ultimately, we had, at the very least, a genuine sphere of influence in there, specifically for quite some time. We used it as a really beautiful place for people to chill, relax. It was a lavish paradise. Havana, you know what I'm saying? And, there was a bit of a dichotomy there between the people who were living in poverty, for the most part, and then their dictatorial leader, who was effectively under the backing of the American people, or not the American people, the American government. And then, communists come in, Fidel Castro, Guevara, Che, that mass murder, and ultimately end up taking over. They end up winning. The revolution wins, which, by the way, I think is really interesting, because the socialists, the Democratic Socialists of America, basically are standing by the Cuban Revolution, etc., the revolutionaries. But specifically, what they're saying is the actual Cuban government, because the Cuban government is still considered the revolution. So, if anything, that the Democratic Socialists are saying when it comes to the Cuban people and the revolution, they're basically saying, yeah, we support the people, but also we support, communism and all that stuff, and the government. Anyways, Fidel Castro takes over. He basically has 60 years of really up and down, just straight up, it's communism. What do you expect? And their lives were probably better than most communist states, in fairness, only because they were backed by the Soviet Union. They had products that they could get out, but once the Soviet Union fell, everything fell apart there. People died, and that's when you started hearing the stories of, Cuban refugees trying to swim across the Atlantic, and in order to actually get to Florida, and where Florida is now basically a red state because of Cuba. So, good on them. And ultimately, I think it's just really fascinating that they're finally basically rising up, because once Fidel died, I think his brother took over, who's just as old too, but he's basically had the reins for almost the last decade or so far, and ultimately things haven't improved. And then, with COVID and them being aggressively locked down, they just could not afford a lockdown, and it's reached a point where they were basically fighting it back against the revolution, the government. And, they're taking to the streets, waving around the American flag, and everyone's losing their minds, both on the left and the right, because the right are like, hey, look at this, we're not racist, we're freedom. And then the left are trying to basically just justify a whole bunch of different things. They've been quiet. Everybody's been quiet. It's taken Bernie like 3 days just to talk about it. And it's kind of fascinating and interesting. And so far, at the very least of this recording, things are getting worse. The military has been deployed. A couple people have died, but they're still holding strong so far in Cuba. And I think it's really interesting how certain people have basically politically and ideologically kind of pushed this and moved this ultimately, because you're basically set on your side regardless. And I think this is where people are kind of starting to wake up in a very strange way. It's good and the bad. You take it for what it is, and you just move along with it. That's just my thoughts, and there's nothing that you probably haven't heard, but it's always kind of interesting to kind of put things together in amalgamation and kind of think things through, even if it's just for a short moment. Thanks, y'all.